The case featured in this episode has been researched using police records, court documents, witness statements, and the news. Listener discretion is advised. All parties mentioned are innocent until proven guilty, and all opinions are my own. Hey everyone, my name is Nikki Young, and this is Serial Napper, the true crime podcast for naps. I'm back with another true crime story to lull you to sleep, or perhaps to give you nightmares. This is episode 4 of another season of Serial Nightmare, a Halloween series that I do every year for the month of October. So everything I release this month will either be Halloween related or a little bit more on the spooky side, but of course, always true crime. It was the night before Halloween, October 30th, 1975, also known as Mischief Night, an evening filled with pranks like throwing toilet paper on trees and egging houses. For 15-year-old Martha Moxley, it was an ordinary night of hanging out with her friends, including 15-year-old Michael Skakel and his 17-year-old brother Tommy. The Skakel boys were part of a wealthy, well-known family related to American political royalty, the Kennedys. Before the clock struck midnight, Martha would be violently murdered, her battered body found under a pine tree near her Belle Haven home the following morning. She had been bludgeoned with a golf club, one that would match a set from the Skakel home. It was a vicious attack that felt extremely personal, with several potential suspects, varying witness statements, alibis, and motives. What followed was a messy murder investigation and a trial that would take decades to unfold. So, dim the lights, put your phone down, and listen to the tragic unsolved murder of Martha Moxley, a beautiful life lost in a world of privilege, leading many to question if the wealthy truly are above the law. So, let's jump right in. Martha Moxley was known as the It Girl. Born on August 16, 1960 in Oakland, California, to her parents David and Dorothy, she's been described as a ray of sunshine by those who knew her. This California girl spent the majority of her life living in the hilly suburbs of Montclair, about an hour away from LA. She had a very active childhood, enjoying activities like ballet, piano, and the Girl Scouts. She was the kind of girl who needed a full social calendar in order to be happy. Martha absolutely thrived being around other people. So basically, she was the complete opposite of who I am as a person. When she was in the 7th grade, her family, including her parents and older brother John, moved to Piedmont, where she attended junior high as an honor student. She was also voted the girl with the best personality by her classmates. Close family friend Rosemary would say, quote, "She was very bright in the gifted class, and her family felt that she might enjoy the challenge at a private school." Another one of her strengths was her ability to adapt to change, which was needed because after a short stint in Piedmont, her father was transferred to New York. The Moxley family moved into the quiet upscale community of Belle Haven in Greenwich, Connecticut. They purchased a beautiful 3-acre property in this gated community, feeling like it would be a safe place to continue raising their family. Belle Haven was home to wealthy families. Think CEOs, politicians, doctors, and lawyers. Now, as a military brat, I can testify to how challenging it is to move to a new school, especially as a teenager. High school is hard enough. But then having to start over at a place where you know no one, friend groups at that point, they've already been established, especially if you're moving into an area where generations of families have lived. It's really tough. But Martha, she stepped right up to the challenge. She signed up for field hockey and basketball. She became the sports editor of the yearbook, and she was once again an honor student. She seemed to be thriving in her new life. The pretty blonde teenager with braces had also found a small friend group to fall in with. It was this friend group that she was hanging out with on the evening of October 30th, 1975, the night before Halloween. Now, it might be a regional thing because I've never heard of it, but the kids in the area called it Mischief Night. Basically, it was an evening of pranks where the younger crowd would TP trees and egg each other's houses, other silly little pranks like that. On this night, Martha was hanging out at the Skakel family home, which was just across the street from her own house. The Skakels were very wealthy. They had what's referred to as old money, inherited from the family's mining company. They were also related to American royalty, the Kennedys. Rushton Skakel, head of the household, he had a sister named Ethel who was married to Robert Kennedy in 1950. The 7 Skakel kids were cousins with the younger Kennedys, and they made sure that everyone around them knew it. The matriarch of the Skakel family, Anne, had recently died from cancer, and the patriarch, Rushton, he was struggling to parent their 7 children, meaning he worked a lot and then he took a lot of vacations while the kids were left to do whatever they wanted to do. Needless to say, there was a lot of partying and underage drinking happening in the home. It's said that at just 13 years old, one of the boys, Michael, had already developed a drinking problem. They were rich, entitled, and left mostly to their own devices. What could possibly go wrong? Martha was a friend to all 7 Skakel children, but on this night, she was hanging out with 15-year-old Michael Skakel and 2 other friends in a Lincoln that was parked in their driveway. Michael and Martha were sitting in the front seat, with the other teens piled into the back of the car. It was around 9 p.m. that night when older brother, 17-year-old Tommy, decided to join them. He squeezes into the front seat with Martha and Michael, and they all listen to music in the car until around 9:30 p.m. That's when 2 of the other Skakel boys come out of the house and say that they need the car to drive over to their cousin's house to watch the U.S. premiere of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Martha and her friends, along with Tommy, all get out of the car and go hang out elsewhere in the neighborhood. Michael stays behind and would later say that he went with his 2 brothers to go to his cousin's house. Now, the 2 other friends with Martha and Tommy, they don't stay around too long because she and Tommy, they're getting really flirty and maybe a bit hot and heavy, playing around with each other, fooling around, and some making out. So these 2 other people, they take off. What happens after they leave, no one knows, but we do know that Martha would not return home that night, and she would never live to see the light of day. Around 1 a.m., her mother notices that her daughter still isn't back, and she begins to worry, so she starts calling all of her friends, but no one has seen or heard from Martha since they were all hanging out earlier in the evening. The following day, Martha still wasn't home, and now her mother is completely distressed. She calls the police to alert them that her daughter was missing, and then she went out looking for her. Dorothy knew that Martha had been over at the Skakel house, so that's her first stop. According to Dorothy, Michael is the one who answers the door, and he appears to be hungover. She asks if he has seen Martha, so he checks around their home and reports back to Dorothy that Martha was not there. Word spread quickly that Martha was missing, and her friends began to organize groups to go out and look for her in the neighborhood. It was just before noon on Halloween day when she was found. Her battered body was discovered underneath a tree located on the back of her family's property. One of her friends had only just spotted the body because it had been shielded amongst tall grass. It was a bloody scene. Whatever had happened to her was very violent. Her light blonde hair was unrecognizable because it was stained red. Her pants were pulled down to her knees, but later tests would reveal that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. The police were called and they quickly set up a crime scene perimeter. There was evidence that Martha had been dragged from her driveway over to the tree where her body had been found. Near the driveway, investigators located a piece of the murder weapon. It was the head of a golf club. Martha Moxley had been bludgeoned to death so violently that part of the shaft of the golf club had broken off, and then it had been used to stab her in the neck. The sheer rage that was showed in this attack was shocking. Who would want to hurt the California girl that everyone seemed to love? They lived in a safe, secure, upscale neighborhood. Much of the community felt like it had to be an outsider. It couldn't possibly be one of them. Investigators continued searching the neighboring properties for any other evidence that may have been discarded. And that's when they find a matching golf club on the Skakel property. It was clearly from the same set of clubs that the one that was used to kill Martha was from. When they questioned the Skakel family, they learned that this particular golf set was owned by Ann Skakel, who had passed away 2 years prior. Clearly, it wasn't Ann who had last used it. The police questioned both 15-year-old Michael Skakel and 17-year-old Thomas Skakel. Both admitted that they had been with Martha earlier on in the evening. Based on statements made by neighbors who had heard their dogs barking around the time of the murder, it was believed that Martha had been killed sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Michael told the police that the last time he saw Martha was around 9:30, when he left with his brothers to go to his cousin Jimmy's home. Martha, her 2 friends, and his older brother Tommy all stayed behind. Tommy also reported that it was shortly after 9:30 p.m. that he last saw Martha. The two were playfully goofing around for a bit after getting out of the car, but then he decided that it was time to go inside to write a report on Abraham Lincoln for school. Though police would later learn this whole story about the Abraham Lincoln report was bogus, Tommy did have a solid alibi. He had been seen inside of his home around 10 p.m. by Ken Littleton. Now, Ken had very recently been hired as a tutor, and he had just moved into the Skakel home. He confirmed to the police that Tommy was at the home around 10 p.m. and that the two of them were watching TV together. He also reported that Tommy was acting very normal, like nothing was wrong or anything had happened. It's difficult to imagine that a person just having committed such a violent and bloody murder would be able to keep a calm composure. Still, Tommy was the last person to see Martha alive. As investigators began to speak to Martha's friends and neighbors, they have trouble identifying a particular suspect. The Skakel family appeared to have alibis backed up by witnesses, yet something still felt a little off about their stories. And what about the murder weapon coming from their house? Police were also learning about the complicated relationship between Martha and Tommy. It was pretty well known that Tommy had a crush on Martha, and he wanted to date her, but she didn't necessarily feel the same way. Martha was also casually dating a boy named Peter at the time. This was backed up in diary entries written by Martha shortly before her death. One entry from September 12, 1975 read, quote, "Dear Diary, today was nothing extra special at school. Peter was being his usual self. Me, Jackie, Michael, Tom, Hope, Maureen, and Andra went driving in Tom's car. I drove a little, and then I was practically sitting on Tom's lap, 'cause I was only steering. He kept putting his hand on my knee. I drove some more, and Margie and I kept yelling out of the sunroof. And then we went to Friendly's, and Michael treated me, and he got me a double, but I only wanted a single. So I threw the top scoop out the window. Then I was driving again, and Tom put his arm around me. He kept doing stuff like that. Jesus, if Peter ever found out, I would be dead. I think Jackie really likes Michael, and I think maybe he likes her. Maybe because he was drunk, but I don't know." Speaking of Peter, because obviously we always look to the significant other first, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. His mother had asked him if he'd like to maybe borrow the car to go hang out with Martha that evening, but he didn't have a valid driver's license, and he had smoked some pot, so he didn't want to risk it, and he ended up staying home watching TV before falling asleep. This would be backed up by his mother and by passing a lie detector test. I just wanted to mention this now because obviously, if perhaps he had caught Martha and Tommy together, he may have had a motive. In another entry, she wrote, quote, "Michael was so totally out of it, he was being a real asshole in his actions and words. He kept telling me that I was leading Tom on when I don't like him, except as a friend. I said, well, how about you and Jackie? You keep telling me that you don't like her, and you're all over her. He doesn't understand that he can be nice to her without hanging all over her. Michael jumps to conclusions. I can't be friends with Tom just because I talk to him. It doesn't mean I like him. I really have to stop going over there. The police didn't have any evidence that pointed to Tommy or anyone else in particular. So at that point, no arrests were made. Still, the investigation continued. Police looked closely at the Skakel tutor, Ken Littleton. Shortly after Martha's murder, he was fired by the family, and his life quickly went downhill. He began to drink, do drugs, and he was arrested for petty crime. Maybe the guilt of killing Martha was eating him alive. But what possible motive did he have? He didn't even know the young girl, and with how violent the crime was, police thought that the killer was likely someone who was close to her. It felt very personal. The years would pass, and Martha's killing went unsolved. And then, another case related to the Skakel and the Kennedy family, it would hit the news, sparking a renewed interest in Martha's murder, which was now a cold case. William Kennedy Smith was charged with rape in 1991. Because of the defendant's last name, the trial would make headline news worldwide. Rumors began to swirl that maybe this Kennedy family member was connected to Martha's death. There were even false allegations made that he was at the Skakel home the night of the murder. Ultimately, William Kennedy Smith was acquitted, and the rumors of his involvement in Martha's murder, they all died down, but the public pressed the police to find Martha's real killer. Without any new information or tips, investigators didn't really have any avenues to pursue, so they created a tip hotline and they announced a reward for any information leading to an arrest. While the police are reviewing their files and following up with any new potential witnesses, the Skakel family hires their own investigator. They want to get ahead of this whole thing, knowing that both Tommy and Michael are pretty much suspect number 1 and number 2 as being 2 of the last people to see Martha alive. The information discovered in this private investigation would be compiled into a file known as the Sutton Report, and it was full of new, shocking revelations that would change things up completely. Both Tommy and Michael's stories that they had initially told the police had changed. Originally, Tommy told police that he said goodbye to Martha and headed inside to work on that school report at around 9:30 p.m. But when interviewed by the Sutton investigators, he claimed it was later than that, and that he and Martha had spent around 20 minutes making out, getting hot and heavy, which would line up with Ken Littleton's report that he saw Tommy inside the house around 10 p.m. But it does leave that half-an-hour gap of time that is kind of unaccounted for. Most shockingly was Michael's news story. His official statement to the police said that he went with his 2 brothers to go to his cousin Jimmy's house, and he didn't return home until around 11:30 p.m. when he went directly to bed. But that wasn't true. Now Michael said that he arrived home and he was drunk and horny, so he decided to climb a tree located just outside of Martha's bedroom window, and then he masturbated. There's actually an audio recording of Michael himself talking about the situation. In the 90s, he was working on an autobiography called Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. And in this audio recording, he could be heard saying, quote, "I pulled my pants down. I masturbated for 30 seconds in the tree. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I hope to God nobody saw me jerk off. Then I woke up to Mrs. Moxley saying, Michael, have you seen Martha? And I was like, oh my God, did they see me last night?" This recording would later become a contentious piece of evidence. It didn't look good for Michael, and it didn't help that now, 20 years later, there were people coming forward claiming that Michael had admitted to murdering Martha Moxley. John Higgins and Gregory Coleman attended a reform school with Michael when they were teenagers in the 70s. Michael had been sent to this residential substance abuse treatment center for youths when he was caught drinking and driving at just 17 years old. Remember, Michael is the one that allegedly had a drinking problem at just 13. Higgins alleged that Michael had confided in him about his memory from the night of the murder. According to Higgins, Michael told him that he remembered rummaging through the family's golf clubs that were stored in the garage. And then he remembers running through tall grass and seeing some pine trees. He said that he couldn't remember if he had actually killed Martha, but he thought maybe he had. Coleman claimed that Michael would brag about his family's wealth and status, going as far as to say that he could get away with murder if he wanted to. According to Coleman, Michael said something to the effect of, quote, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." He also allegedly confessed that he beat Martha with the golf club after he had made a move on her and she rejected him. With these witness statements and Michael's new story of what happened that night, investigators felt like they finally had enough evidence to pursue murder charges. Charges against Michael Skakel, who was now 41 years old. The prosecution alleged that his motive was rage and jealousy. Martha had been fooling around with Michael's older brother, Tommy, that evening. But when Michael made a move on her, she rejected him. She turned him down. And this enraged him, so he retrieved a golf club from his garage, and then he viciously beat her, according to the prosecution. They called several witnesses who all told the jury that Michael had either confided in them that he had killed Martha, or he implied that he was involved. There were also concerns with his changing story. First, he went with his brothers in the car to his cousin's house, came home, and went to bed long after Martha had allegedly been killed. Then, after returning from his cousin's house, he was drunk, he climbed a tree near Martha's home, and he masturbated. However, there was a witness called to the stand that even further discredited Michael. Andrea Shakespeare was at the Skakel home that night, and she said that Michael never left with his brothers. He stayed behind. The prosecution also played that damning audio recording of Michael where he says, "Oh my God, did they see me last night?" Michael didn't really have much of a defense, despite hiring a big-wig expensive lawyer. All he really had was his denial that he did it. It took the jury just 4 days to convict Michael of Martha's murder and sentence him to 20 years to life in prison. But not everyone believed that Michael was the real killer. His cousin, Robert Kennedy Jr., spoke publicly at lengths about how he believed Michael was innocent and that his trial was a miscarriage of justice. His main point of contention was that audio clip that was played to the jury, which made it appear as if Michael himself was confessing to the murder. The portion of the audio that was played was, quote, "Oh my God, did they see me last night?" But the prosecution left out the parts where he's actually referring to getting caught masturbating in that tree, not getting caught killing Martha. Robert Kennedy Jr. began a crusade to find the real killer because he did not believe that Michael was the one. He started doing media interviews and speaking publicly about the matter. He even wrote a book, and he was calling for a retrial. That's when he received a tip from a man named Tony Bryant, who was Michael's former classmate. Tony allegedly confessed to being involved in Martha's murder. In a recorded confession, he alleged that on the night in question, he and 2 friends, Al Hasbrook and Burton Tinsley, they made a trip to Belle Haven, Martha's gated community. According to Tony, Al was completely obsessed with Martha, and the two had met on a few different occasions, including at a dance. Tony said that Al and Burton had stolen some golf clubs from the Skakel backyard earlier in the night, and now the two were talking about how they wanted to hurt someone. Tony claimed to not want anything to do with whatever they had planned, so he says he left. But later that night, when he met up with Al and Burton again, the two confessed to going through with their plan and hurting someone. After hearing about Martha's body being found the next morning, he put the pieces together. It had to have been Al and Burton who killed her. With this new confession, Michael filed an appeal for a new trial, but it was denied. It didn't help that Tony was no longer willing to cooperate when he learned that he would have to testify in court without being offered any sort of immunity for his knowledge of the murder. It should be noted here that Al and Burton, they both deny even being in Belle Haven that night. And there are no witnesses who saw them there. Al was a young Black man, and the Belle Haven community was predominantly a white, affluent community. So if he was there, it's likely that someone would have noticed. Also, there isn't any other evidence to connect either man to the murder. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. And so that would keep Michael in jail for now, but not for long. Michael hired a new attorney named Hubert Santos, and they argued ineffective counsel at his 2002 trial when he was represented by defense attorney Mickey Sherman. Their reasons included his former attorney leaving out a key witness who supported Michael's alibi. Michael claimed to be at his cousin's house at the time of the murder. Though his brothers and cousin could back him up on those claims, they obviously weren't taken very seriously because his family could easily just lie for him. However, there was another witness named Dennis Osorio who was also at the cousin's residence that night. He had no relation to Michael and no real reason to lie for him. Yet, he was never interviewed or called to the stand by Michael's original lawyer. Michael also claimed that his former attorney failed to call other suspects in the murder case, like Tommy, Michael's brother, who just so happened to be the last person to see Martha alive. His testimony alone could have been enough to raise reasonable doubt to keep Michael out of jail. According to Michael, his press-loving attorney botched his entire trial. To the surprise of many, especially Martha's friends and family, the jury agreed and overturned his conviction. He walked out of prison as a free man after spending 11 years behind bars. But his legal woes, they weren't over. In 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated his conviction. Michael fought this ruling, and then the Connecticut Supreme Court reversed itself again. The judge ruled that Michael Skakel should have a new trial. But that day would never come. Ultimately, the state of Connecticut decided that they would not retry him for Martha Moxley's murder. For whatever reason, they felt like they just didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction. So much time had passed since the murder that, out of the 51 potential witnesses, 17 of them were now dead, and there was no new forensic evidence that would actually help the case. No one else to this day has been charged with Martha's killing, meaning that after almost 50 years, her murder remains unsolved. Police suspect that either Michael or Tommy, who are now completely estranged from one another, one of them, or maybe even both of them, committed the crime, but they simply can't prove it. At the beginning of this year, in January, Michael sued the case's lead police investigator and the town of Greenwich for alleged malicious prosecution and civil rights violations. According to court records obtained by CBS, the defendants, quote, knew that there were other more likely suspects and that there was no probable cause to arrest and or maintain a prosecution against the plaintiff, Michael Skakel, but continued to do so intentionally and maliciously in order to convict a Kennedy cousin. The lawsuit was seeking an unspecified amount of monetary compensation. However, I haven't seen any updates about whether it was settled outside of court or was being fought. So, what happened the night before Halloween in Belle Haven? There's only one, maybe two people who know. Unfortunately, the truth has been buried for decades, and unless money stops talking, we may never know who killed Martha. I'm going to end this episode with a short clip from Martha's mother, Dorothy, from an interview 10 years ago.
I pray there will be a conviction in the case. I believe that prayers are answered. I really think that in this country today, there are too many crimes that are not punished. And I think that the people are just taking advantage of this. The moral fiber of the United States seems to be falling by the wayside because people are not punished for crimes that they do. I know maybe there are a lot of people that don't agree with me, but I think that we need to show people that you cannot do these things without being punished.
That's it for me tonight. If you want to reach out, you can find me on Facebook at Serial Napper. You can find my audio on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. I post all of my episodes in video format over on YouTube, so go check it out. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'd love if you can give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Every little bit helps. I'm over on X, formerly known as Twitter, serial_napper, and I post things on TikTok, Serial Napper Nick, and that's all one word. Until next time, sweet dreams, stay kind, especially in the comments. Bye.